we're going to talk a little bit about space habitats and decompression illness. And I apologize to Mike that I don't have a picture of him up here. But as a Canadian, I had to throw our first Canadian spacewalker up. So there's Kris Hadfield right there in his spacesuit. And as you know, a spacesuit is essentially a spacecraft. And the atmosphere, the environment within a spacecraft can be quite variable. And the ISS is designed to be a shirt sleeve environment, meaning that it's one atmosphere, just like the room that we're in right now, and it's 21% oxygen. But in order to be able to move within a spacesuit, you have to lower the pressure. And when you lower the pressure, you have to increase the amount of oxygen. And this, in and of itself, might not necessarily be a problem. However, one of the potential risks in space is decompression illness. So just like you can get the bends when you go scuba diving, the problem in space is that you have decompressive stress on your body. Every time you move from high pressure to low pressure, it can cause problems. And those problems are related to the nitrogen in our tissues. If we have too much nitrogen in our tissues and we move from high pressure to low pressure, then unfortunately, that nitrogen forms bubbles. And the bubbles cause problems. And they have problems with blood flow. They affect tissues and distort tissues, and they cause inflammatory changes. And if these things happen in your brain or your spinal cord or your lungs, they can cause a serious problem. And so one of the things that we can do in spaceflight to mitigate this risk is we can adjust something called the tissue nitrogen ratio, which looks at the amount of nitrogen relative to the environmental pressure. And so we mitigate the risk of decompression illness in space by controlling ambient pressures, either in the station or in the spacesuit. And we also reduce the amount of nitrogen in your body by having the astronauts breathe 100% oxygen before they perform their spacewalk to get rid of that nitrogen, which could cause problems. So just one of the challenges that we face in spaceflight is decompression illness. Now another one, which unfortunately affects quite a few astronauts, is space motion sickness. And it can onset fairly quickly, but it typically isn't debilitating and doesn't last for too long. So in general, it rarely lasts more than 2 days. So it's often less than that. And one of the things about space motion sickness, which is most interesting from a biomedical challenge standpoint, is that we don't really know what causes it. So we have good ideas and some theories about what causes it, but it's not exactly clear what it is. It's basically thought to be a combination of mixed signals from your body, not understanding what's happening when you're in a microgravity environment. Now, one of the things, even if we don't know what causes it, if we could predict who's going to get sick, that would be helpful. But there really isn't a very reliable predictor for space motion sickness. So you may have terrible motion sickness on the ground and be great in space, and vice versa. So it's very hard to know who is going to get this. But what we can say is that we can treat it, but there is no other treatment in flight other than giving people medications to deal with their symptoms. So yet another challenge that we have to deal with in space. Another challenge that we're going to talk about is vibration in the human body. So if this whole room started shaking and didn't stop shaking, it would cause problems for all of us. And as you can imagine, spacecraft have a fair amount of vibration to them, and they shake quite a bit at times. And if you're exposed to that vibration for a long period of time, we don't tolerate that very well. And for people that are chronically exposed to it, people like, for instance, helicopter pilots who are in a vibration environment, they often end up with chronic back and neck problems. Now, hopefully you're not going to be experiencing that kind of vibration in spaceflight, but in spaceflight, if there is vibration, it can have a deleterious effect upon your performance, both your vision and your cognitive performance, and it's going to have a serious impact on your hand-eye coordination as well. Along with vibration comes noise, and it's not hard to imagine in spaceflight how there are many sources of noise, and in fact, you can listen to what it sounds like roughly on the International Space Station. You can go online and you can search for it, and you can have a listen to what it sounds like. And the levels on the station can peak around 50 to 60 decibels, which is pretty loud and annoying, if you will, especially if it is constant or persistent. And so our responses, the human body, the way it responds to persistent noise, first of all, physiologically we don't like it. So it causes problems with our hearing, causes vertigo and nausea, but ultimately can also make it difficult to sleep. It also affects our psyche, and psychologically it can cause frustration. You can become fixated upon the stimulus. Anyone who's ever had ringing in their ears or tinnitus can understand what that is. But then last but not least, it also causes fatigue and performance degradation, and we don't want that in a spaceflight environment. The last challenge that I'll talk about are toxic exposures. And you can imagine right now in this room, in our environment, there aren't a lot of things in our environment which are likely to be harmful to us. But in a completely closed environment like a spacecraft, everything in your environment could potentially be harmful to you. So contamination of air, water, or food can cause you serious problems. Infectious diseases like mold or fungus growth on station is one potential problem that we have to deal with. Sanitation issues are extremely important. I once had an astronaut tell me that when the toilet is broken on a spacecraft, nothing else matters until the toilet is fixed. Last but not least, hypergolic fuels, which are very toxic, or a fire which could lead to carbon monoxide poisoning, are things which will be very, very bad on a spacecraft and are large biomedical challenges that we have to face. So I'll wrap it up there, and I'll invite Vince to come up and give us more about some of the more complex biomedical challenges.
All right, thanks. Thanks, Kris. Thanks, everybody, for joining us this afternoon. As Kris said, I'm going to add a little bit to all of the challenges that are out there, and neither of us are going to expound on all of them. Maybe Bill will fill in the rest when he gets up here. But a little bit about myself before I get started. I started my aerospace medicine career in the Air Force, did 26 years there taking care of fighter pilots, and then I joined NASA, where I work actually at NASA headquarters here. And my job specifically is doing policy and oversight for anything health and medical within the agency. So human health and in space flight is part of that. There's some other things too, but I'll jump into what I wanted to talk to you about today, and we'll talk about just a few of the hazards that are going to be facing explorers beyond low Earth orbit. The first one being space radiation, and this picture here depicts the radiation coming off of the sun at our Earth. And most of it, thankfully, gets deflected around us by the magnetic field around the Earth. Without the magnetic field, we'd be exposed to the full brunt of the sun's radiation, and it'd be hard for much life to survive that. So thankfully, we have the magnetic field. But if you're outside the magnetic field, which you're only protected sort of in low Earth orbit, once you leave that, even going to the moon, you're sort of exposed to that full brunt of not only the sun's radiation, but galactic radiation. And those have, it's a lot more radiation to begin with, but it's a different kind of radiation too. So we're kind of familiar with, our bodies have evolved with galactic radiation, galactic gamma rays. Those are similar to X-rays that you get at the doctor's office. And this picture in the middle here, I'm going to use the pointer so you guys can both see. Anyway, this picture in the middle here is sort of a depiction of what it would look like in a cell being hit with X-rays or gamma rays. So you can't see the pointer. Sorry, I'm going to have to fall back. Maybe I won't. All right, so the center picture up here shows sort of the first diffuse activity in a cell, and it's not a lot of activity where it's been fluorescing in any one spot. That's the gamma rays. But outside of our magnetic field, you also have high energy particles and ions that are traveling at the speed of light or close to it. And then when they hit your cell, they have a different effect. And this picture at the bottom here, which if I can get my laser pointer to work, shows sort of the dense and linear pathway that one of those ions would make going through the cell. The damage there is much more concentrated. If you can kind of think of back to high school DNA, when X-rays hit a cell, it might knock off a hydrogen molecule or something like that. When an iron molecule goes through a cell, it's going to take out a whole chunk of all the base pairs, you know. So our bodies, like I said, have evolved for radiation like gamma rays, and we have repair mechanisms that can fix that. But when the damage from a high energy particle goes through the cell and hits the DNA, there's no mechanism to fix that, and so the cell only has one option at that point, and that's to stop living. So that's a bad thing, of course, if it's an important cell to you. So the outcomes of that, we have 4 different outcomes. One of those is cancer. That would be sort of the long-term health effects that we would be worried about for any kind of worker exposed to radiation. But that's not during the mission. That would be their long-term, down the road sort of thing. We do worry about the acute and maybe chronic or late central nervous effects that might occur, but we don't know a lot about that right now. It's hard to study this because that radiation doesn't exist on Earth. We got to go outside of the radiation belt to get to it, or have very special cyclotrons to do that. So the research has been very small up to this point, and on smaller or more basic living organisms. So that still is a question to be answered. And then we have chronic and degenerative tissue issues. So the cataracts that form in your eyes are probably due to some radiation exposure over life, and your heart muscle doesn't do very well with exposure to radiation. So we worry about that. There's others too. And then if you get exposed to an acute exposure, high dose exposure, like say from a solar flare, then you might have acute prodromal problems like nausea and vomiting, or some anemia that might persist afterwards. So we worry about all of those. The picture on the far right there, the vertical lines, is just the difference between ions that go through a media like cell tissue. The ones on the left are hydrogen, so that's sort of a low weight molecule, and the ones on the right are iron, and you can see that it's got a much bigger damage ratio, so to speak. And then the bottom right picture is another added challenge for us. When you think about how you're going to protect against this, putting shielding up sometimes can be a little bit counterproductive. So this is a picture, a model of what would happen when some of those high energy particles go through an aluminum skin. When they come out the other side, they take some aluminum with them, and now you got aluminum and the particles hitting it instead of just the one that was flying through space. And so you actually, whatever's between you and the radiation can be part of the problem. So we're concerned, we want to do research about this because this could be mission limiting to some extent. So right now, if you spend enough time in space, we feel that you exceed the radiation risk that we want to give any worker, any astronaut in our agency. And you can do that with 1, 2, 3, 4 short duration missions. We talked short duration being about 6 months right now. We're looking at going to 12-month missions, so that's going to make it a little bit more challenging to do multiple missions. Going to the moon, you get some protection there, but you can only stay up there for about 4 to 7 months. And these numbers are general numbers. A lot of the research that's going on right now is trying to define those numbers and make them a little bit more solid. But, and then, of course, any missions going to Mars are going to be challenged by that. And even the proposed flyby mission is going to be right at the edge of what might be acceptable right now. And we're putting this in context with other workers in the United States that work in hazardous environments. And we don't think that sending somebody to Mars necessarily should be more risky. It may be, and I'll talk more about that sort of balancing act at the end. A interesting risk that's come up recently is visual impairment, intracranial pressure increase. And I say recently is that we've noticed it recently, probably in the last 4 years. And when you go up into space and you don't have the gravity pulling all the fluids down to your lower extremities, they tend to rise up into your upper body or into your head. And the cerebral spinal fluid does the same thing and increases the pressure in your head. And if it does that for a long time, you get some chronic manifestations of that. And this slide here shows what some of those might be. So we'll start down in the lower right corner, and that little circle there is on an ultrasound. It may be hard to see, but what it's trying to show is that the optic nerve has swollen up because the pressure coming out of the cranial vault into the back of the eye is swelling up that nerve. Then the result of that is the next slide up on the right, the retina there. If you haven't looked at a lot of retinas, that's a fuzzy retina because the back of the retina now has been pushed forward a little bit and it's engorged with fluids, so it's fuzzy, which would impair your visual acuity. And then both of those together, all that pushing of the back of your eye causes the eye to flatten. And this picture down here in the lower left shows the one on the right shows the eye is a little bit flattened compared to a normal eyeball. And that's going to affect your visual acuity because now the image that comes through your lens doesn't focus in the right place. And so you're going to need different glasses when that occurs. And they actually do change glasses for some astronauts on orbit. And then lastly, if you have enough of that sort of chronic congestion, stuff like that, you can start to affect the functioning of the retina. And the picture in the center down in the bottom shows a frank loss of vision in a very focal area because of this process that goes on. And when we look in people's eyes, we can actually see some flat lines up in the upper right-hand corner. We call them choroidal folds, where the retina has sort of been scrunched together a little bit as it got flattened. So this has occurred in a pretty significant percentage of the astronauts that have flown. The functional manifestation hasn't been a major problem. So it hasn't changed people's vision majorly, and it hasn't been a significant problem on orbit. But doctors can see all these things that are going on, and it concerns us because we don't want it to get worse. Thankfully, when they've gotten to the ground, they've all resolved. So it's not a permanent thing, but what we don't know is with extended times, going past 6 months, whether this might persist or even get worse. So certainly something that we're looking at. And this is a function of microgravity. There may be something else going on. The space station carries a higher CO2 level, and the body reacts to CO2 by increasing the pressure going to your head. And so that may be contributory. It may be the reason. We're not sure which is which, but we're certainly looking at both of those. So bone loss and muscle loss are something that's been a concern since the beginning of space flight. It was recognized early on that both of those will decrease if you don't do something about it. We've had an active campaign lately to try to counteract that, and the reason why is when your astronauts get someplace, you want them to do something, whether it's a press conference in front of the spacecraft or whether it's trying to do something at Mars when you get there. If you can't stand up because you break your leg, it doesn't help the mission very much. So what's happening is the density, the calcium and the strength part of the bone, and the x-ray there with the square and the circle show sort of the weight-bearing parts of your body that every day when you're on Earth are presented with a challenge of counteracting the weight, and so they become stronger, and that bone is strong enough to hold that. When you get into space, the bone starts to resorb a little bit, and what you see on the upper right is a hip bone, normal looking. It has a sort of a bridge work, mesh work inside it, and then it has a cortical outside of it that's very strong for the shaft of the bone. And then the pictures on the bottom, on the left is sort of a normal vertebral body, and then the one on the right would be one from somebody who has osteoporosis after they're about 80 years old or so. And you can see that there's a lot less of the bridge work in the middle of it. So if you can maintain your bones on orbit, which they're doing right now with a lot of exercise, weightlifting, that sort of thing, you don't get to this point. If you let it go on orbit, when you come back down and you're presented with the challenge of Earth gravity again, your body builds back the bone. But unfortunately, it only builds it, I shouldn't say only does, but it primarily builds it back in the cortical part, the thick outside of it, not the bridge work in the middle of it. So our concern with letting that process continue unabated would be that you might have a higher risk of fractures later on when you came back to Earth because you don't have the ability to flex your bones as well as you could before. Right now we have the luxury, if somebody gets really ill on orbit, of coming back and taking care of them within a short period of time, relatively short period of time. if you've been at the conference since yesterday, you heard Mr. Bolden talk about the fact that we're going to leave the sort of Earth-dependent part now and go out where we can't be dependent on Earth. So we got to take our medical care with us, and that would be it'd be helpful to inform ourselves on what might occur when you go that far away, so you can bring the right stuff to take care of it and maybe try to avoid potential people that might be at higher risk for some things. And so what we've done at NASA is come up with a modeling tool that can predict some of the things that might occur, and we've used it on the space station, which we've had up for 14 years. And these are the list of things that we thought might occur that might require you to be evacuated back home in that period of time. Now, thankfully, we've been up there for 14 years and haven't had to evacuate for any of these yet. But this would be sort of what we would be worried about, is the human body might expect something to break down while you're up there. And this is all based, this particular list is based on a 6-month stay. So when you're talking about maybe a 2 or 3 year stay, then that list might change a little bit. So I mentioned to you before that going to Mars might be a challenge for what we consider exposing somebody to hazards, either known hazards like radiation or unknown hazards that we're not sure about. We just can't characterize, like maybe the visual issue. Right now, we protect workers in the United States against exposures at work to a certain level, and that is uniform across all the hazardous industries, whether it's firefighters or miners or whatever. They should not be exposed to a certain risk above a certain level. And our astronauts are sort of kept in that general vicinity as far as the risk that they're exposed to. But going to Mars might ask us to go to a higher risk level. And the question is how do we as a country or an agency approach that? So we asked the Institute of Medicine to take a look at that for us and to try and give us an ethical framework for making health standards for the future exploration missions. And they did that, and I invite you to check out that study. It's on their internet site. But they gave us a way to approach setting standards that considers more than just health compared to other work industry sites. But they asked us to include such things as, first of all, do as little harm as you can, but also to consider beneficence, so the importance to society or human existence. Also, autonomy. They thought that we should make sure that astronauts that would be volunteering for this were completely informed about what their risks were. And if we were asking them to take an excessive risk, that they would make that decision based on knowledge that they had. And then they had some other recommendations as well. But this is probably going to be important for us as we proceed, whether we need it now for Mars or later on. We are going to get to points where technology can't protect us enough, and we're going to have to ask people to go out there and explore, basically, and take some risks. Our country's done that, our people have done that for all time. So this is going to be very helpful for us, a way to approach that. So with that, I look forward to your questions after everybody else is done. Thank you. Thank you.
Interesting. Technical challenge. Is that, all right, excellent. I just don't know why you can't see the. All right, we'll figure it out. That'll work.
Okay, good afternoon, everybody. My name is Bill Pulaski, and I work actually fairly closely with Vince and his organization. My day job is to run the research arm of the medical organization, trying to understand the large picture about what sorts of impediments the human system might be to exploration missions. So we understand the risks associated with spaceflight, whether it's low Earth orbit or all the way to Mars, and try to run a research program to develop the knowledge and or the technologies to mitigate those risks. I have about $160 million a year budget. I have about 200 grantees out around the United States, and we work closely with other agencies, Russia, ESA, JAXA, and the Canadian Space Agency. So my talk is going to be way back about 50,000 feet and looking at the big picture for how we do what we do at NASA to try and reduce these risks so that when it's time to go to the next set of places that are farther away, that we're going to be we'll be ready to go. So what we've evolved over time is a way of looking at the human risk that starts with the hazards that people are exposed to in spaceflight. And we've broken those down at this time into 5 different kinds of hazards that affect multiple systems. So the first one is altered gravity fields, and that includes both the microgravity field during transit, hypogravity that you might experience on the Mars surface or on the lunar surface, transitions between those gravity environments, and of course between Earth and the zero-G environment of space. And then we also lump into there the launch and landing loads that people get exposed to. The second primary hazard is isolation and confinement, and we couple with that altered light-dark cycles. The third is the hostile closed environment. You've heard a little bit about both of those things. Increased radiation, and then finally distance from Earth. And each of these hazards affects a number of different systems. The one that affects the most systems is probably the altered gravity fields. It affects the bone, muscle, cardiovascular, sensory, motor, and immune systems. It affects the kind of nutrition that we have to provide for crew members. It affects behavior and performance, the human factors of how much space do you need, how it's laid out, and then how do you practice clinical medicine in a zero-G environment or in a partial G environment with especially difficult procedures that you might have to handle. The severity of any of these effects is probably a function of how much time you're exposed to that effect. There's a couple of ones that don't fit that model, but in general, as we get to longer and longer missions, longer time in this regimen, then we have bigger problems. The Health and Medical Technical Authority that Vince comes from have identified a series of risks that we track on a regular basis that are associated with each of these hazards. So on the left we have the altered gravity fields, and you can see radiation and hostile closed environments and all that. Altogether, we're tracking currently about 40 risks, something on the order of 40 risks. And many of those risks we think we can mitigate by either doing research or technology development. And on a regular basis, we have board meetings between the clinicians and the managers and the researchers to try and determine how much we've learned since the last time we've gotten together and what the status of a risk is. When we look at those things, we have a rating system for risks that follows sort of the traditional 5x5 chart, but it's only a 3x4 chart. And we look at consequences of 3 different flavors, actually. On the left, we have consequences that occur during the mission, and they come of 2 flavors, either a health medical issue that might occur during a mission, or a performance issue that might be related to hypogravity or transition of gravity or something that occurs during a mission. On the right, we look at the effects of long-term health, and this might be the increased risk of developing cancer when you're exposed to radiation at high levels, like crew members might be in deep space missions. Each of those consequences is ranked on a scale of very low to high, where high can be death or permanently disabling or permanent disabilities or longer term development of cancers that could affect the quality of life for people. We also look at likelihood of these things occurring. And the likelihood comes in 3 flavors: greater than 1% likelihood that this consequence might occur. Medium would be between 0.1 and 1%, and low is anything below 0.1%. So when we try to mitigate risk, we have two ways we can do it. We can either reduce the likelihood that the risk will occur, either through countermeasures or shielding or selection or some other probability like that, or reduce the consequences using something like exercise to reduce the amount of bone that you might lose or muscle that you might lose during a mission. For sure, anything that has a high consequence and a likelihood that is greater than 0.1%, we're very concerned about, and that's the red area in the upper right. And those things, at this point, a crew member who might be expected on a particular mission to fall into that range would not be one that we would want to send on that mission. Now, what Vince just told us is relatively interesting, because the IOM now says that the ethics are such that if there's an imperative, if there's a NASA imperative that says we need to go on this mission, and we do have some group of people that we think need to fly on that mission, that would fall in the red zone. And a good example of that is the radiation that Vince was talking about. If we have a mission to Mars that's more than 500 days, many of our crew members that are eligible currently would break that limit. And that 500 days is to stay within a limit of 3% excess risk of developing cancer later in life. So if the risk were 4 or 5%, then it can be an agency decision to determine, yes, it's okay for us to do this mission even though we're in a red zone. Nevertheless, the work that I do is to try and get all the reds turned to yellows and all the yellows turned to greens. And you'll see on the next chart, when we get green, we even try to get them to blue, and blue is optimized. And optimized is something that you might, I guess the easiest example is on the space station, we can do very well with exercise. We can protect bone and muscle for people up to 6 months, as Vince said. We have a resistive exercise device that's the size of my car, and it weighs more. When we take a deep space mission to Mars, it's going to have to fit inside of a shoebox. So in optimizing the approach to exercise so that we can reduce the mass, volume, power, and other mission resources becomes an imperative. So in my program, we are tracking about 30 risks, and they're all listed down the left, and it's in text too small for you to read on purpose. I just want you to look at the overall chart. These are things that we're already investing in. And as you go across from left to right, we go from FY14 on the left all the way out to FY28. The research that we're doing is trying to understand the underlying problems and to try and reduce those. All those milestones that you see on there are places where we think there's going to be a transition of knowledge so that we're a little bit better at being able to mitigate those risks. The ones that are on the top of the chart that are in blue on the left-hand side are ones that require ISS to do our research, at least at some point. And the ones in the bottom, in the brown, are ones that don't require ISS. And the one that stands out at the bottom, the red line that goes all the way across to 2020-28, is radiation. And we do radiation research in an analog mostly at Brookhaven National Laboratory, where we expose small animals and tissues to high energy particles to try and understand how to mitigate these risks. We're starting to develop some pharmaceutical and nutraceutical countermeasures to these things that we hope will come around, but it's a long and difficult journey. I invest about $28 million a year in radiation research alone. So that's probably the biggest hog at this trough. But you can get an idea that with the most recent extension of ISS out to 2024, which is that little orange square block up at the top, about 2/3 of the way across, if you look down that line, we think that we're going to be able to mitigate most of the risks that people are going to be exposed to for a Mars mission by about 2024, if the research comes out the way we expect it to. One other problem is that we're limited currently to 6-month missions. If you look at all the data we have on humans in space, we have quite a bit of data on crew members that have been on very short missions, shuttle-type missions, and shuttle precursors. We have a little bit of data on Mir station missions, and we're starting to amass a fair amount of data on ISS for 6-month missions. If our goal is to try and understand what happens at 30 months, and our objective is to try and stay in the green zone, where green is good and yellow is maybe okay, but probably not what you really want to do, and red is to stay away from, then we have to extrapolate out from 6-month missions all the way out. We don't know the time constants for a lot of these problems, and some of them only emerge after we've been in space for a fair amount of time, like the visual impairment problem that Vince said. We never saw that before we started flying longer than 90 days in flight. So you may be aware that next year we're going to fly 2 crew members, a Russian and a U.S. crew member, for a 1-year mission. And we've been asked to look at, would additional 1-year missions help us? And we think, yes, indeed it would. The way to extrapolate, we think, to 30 months missions is to get some more data out at 12 months and to be able to determine that between 6 months and 12 months we're able to protect people in a way that we're pretty sure we've mitigated and gotten to a plateau. So we've asked now for an additional 5 or 6 1-year missions for an additional 10 crew members, and the agencies, both the U.S. and the Russian Space Agency, are looking carefully at how we might do this operationally, and we're expecting that the next one might be as soon as 1 year after the first 1-year mission ends. So we're expecting to get these data soon if everything can come together. So my summary is that human travelers to Mars are going to experience unprecedented physiological, environmental, and psychosocial challenges that could lead to significant health and performance decrements in the absence of effective mitigation strategies. We need to have a program like the one that I managed to be able to develop those mitigation strategies. And I think that the success of any human mission to Mars will hinge on the mission designer's abilities to be able to develop and implement such strategies so that we can protect the humans who are the explorers and the pioneers. And I'll stop there.
Let's see. With any luck. Brilliant. Great. Thanks. Thanks, Kris. Hi, everybody. I'm Michaud Lopez-Alegria. As Kris mentioned, I don't have a MD or a PhD behind my name, and I did not stay in a Holiday Inn Express last night. But so I'm gonna attack this from a little bit different view. Although I do think that this will sort of nicely tie some of the things that we've been hearing before together. If you heard Charlie Bolden speak yesterday, I did not, but I'm sure that one of the things he said was what Bill was saying a while ago, and that is that that we really need the ISS, the research that's being done on it, not just in terms of the actual scientific studies, but just the practice of living aboard to be able to do a mission, a long-duration mission like the one to Mars. And so I flew on 3 short 2-week duration missions on the shuttle, but then I flew a much longer mission to the ISS. This is back in 06, 07. It was 215 days, which up until now is the longest U.S. mission. That record will be broken next year by Scott Kelly and Mikhail Kornienko. And but that experience, which in my personal opinion is fundamentally not that different from a 6-month mission, but because it just turned out that way. But what I want to do is show you not from the 50,000-foot view, but from the 240 nautical mile view about some of the things that we've been hearing about before, and sort of what we're doing about it, and what some of the sort of successes and challenges that are ahead. So these are the topics that I want to cover: exercise, nutrition, the environmental and medical considerations, and then psych support, which is something that I think is very important that is not easy to get your arms around. So on the exercise front, this is not us trying to imitate, the Skylab where they're running around the inside diameter of the upper stage of the Saturn, but this is one of 3 modes of exercise that we have available to us on board. And this is a Dutch astronaut, André Kuipers, and he's on a device called T2, which is a second version of the treadmill. As you can imagine, running on a treadmill is a little bit different when you're in a zero-G environment, because you've got to figure out a way to hold yourself down. And you do that by this bungee system, which obviously has its advantage so that you can sort of adjust the amount of tension relative to your weight. It also has a lot of disadvantages, notably that you're wearing a lot of the load on your neck and on your hips, and you get a lot of chafing and that sort of thing. So
would be exercised for 2 kinds of exercise every day for 2.5 hours total. So part of that would be cardiovascular exercise, the other part would be resistive training. So I chose most of my cardiovascular exercise on a different device, but a lot of people like the treadmill for a lot of reasons. Here's a picture of Sandy Magnus, who's on it. This is on the first version of the treadmill, which was on board when I was there in 06-07. In addition to all the harness and the bungee apparatus, there's a control panel that would actually measure. You would wear a heart rate monitor strap, and it would measure your heart rate, and then you could later correlate that with the loads that the speed at which you were running, and it was a pretty good measurement of your cardiovascular fitness, although not super, let's say, scientific. This is T2 again, and this is Sunny Williams, who's a pretty decent distance runner in her own right. She ran the Boston Marathon on Earth and also in space. When we were on board together in April of 07, she ran 26.2 miles on the treadmill while they were running it on the ground, and she even had a number from Boston. It was pretty neat. The second device we have is the Sivas, which is a cycle ergometer with vibration isolation system. So it's basically that white box that you see in the bottom, and then the frame that you see around behind Jeff Williams here in the picture. And likewise, as an ergometer, it can measure the loads that you're putting into. As you see from this picture here, there's no seat to sit on because you don't really need one. But you need the vibration isolation system because you figure you have like me, a 200-pound astronaut with probably a 50-pound box and a 25-pound frame. That's a lot of loads to be putting into the system. The reason that we're up there is to be able to do science in a microgravity environment. So you don't want to be jiggling the thing every time you're exercising, and it does make a lot of jiggling. So in this picture you can see, I think that's Katie Coleman. It's hard to tell. She's doing probably some kind of physical fitness test, which is obviously measuring her expired gases along with a lot of other things. You can see the isolation system, which is what holds the frame off from the rack, and it's just a simple sort of wire spring apparatus. The third type of exercise device is resistive exercise. For the reasons that Vince mentioned, it's really important to have to continue to load up not only your muscles, but especially your skeletal system to prevent the reabsorption of calcium that happens to all of us while we're up there. This particular device was called IRED, Improved Resistive Exercise Device. I think that's what the I stood for. Anyway, it worked on the principle of rubber bands, basically. So the canisters that you see down by his feet had a resistive, stretchable material in them, and you would add the resistance by turning the number of cranks that you would put on the device. So not terribly precise, but fairly effective. Problem was that a lot of the exercise that we found we needed was to get as heavy a load as we could. And that device was limited in the amount of load that you could put into it. So this is the ARED, the Advanced Resistive Exercise Device, which, as Bill mentioned, unfortunately is as big as a car and weighs more. And that's a problem if we're going to space. So if you think about those three things that I just showed you, the resistive device, the bike, and the treadmill, going to Mars is going to be a really tough challenge because we have a long way to go, and the propulsion technology today is such that we need to make the vehicle as small as possible. This is obviously a problem, so we're going to have to think about how we do that. Just a couple more shots of Steve Swanson and Soichi Noguchi doing squats. Again, most of the types of exercise we do are lower back and especially legs. Next, I want to talk briefly about nutrition. There's a very big psychological component about this, which I'm not going to talk about right now. I just want to talk about sort of the challenges. One of them is just volume, sheer up mass. What you see here is about half of the food containers that are open at any one given time on board the space station. When I was on board, we were a crew of 3. Each of those containers was designed to last a crew of 3 for 10 days. Red for Russian, blue for American, not that important, but the point is that there's a lot of volume and a lot of mass. We have different kinds of food sort of preparations. We have thermostabilized, we think of canned. The Russian food is actually canned in cans. The American food is in these sort of aluminum pouches, I guess. This is Thanksgiving, by the way. It's smoked turkey, candied yams, and cornbread stuffing. And then the second to last kind is this freeze-dried or dehydrated, which is good because it's obviously doesn't have the water in it, but you got to put the water in it somewhere, and the water takes weight and volume as well. Now we're able to recycle a lot of the water that we use on orbit today, so that's a huge advantage. The drinks are similar. We basically squirt water into a Capri-Sun type device that has a powder in it and drink it through a straw. The Russians have a slightly different container, but it's the same idea. This is actually, if you look closely at the drink bag that Misha on the left is holding, you can actually see a tea bag in there. So this is tea. We don't have this kind of beverage on board yet. Psychologically, that might be something to think about if we're going to Mars. And something we definitely don't have on board, at least not very often, is fresh fruit or vegetables. This is obviously during a handover where, well, maybe not obviously, but I can tell by who the people are that it's a handover, and so one crew brought up some fresh stuff with them, and that's a super exciting time for the folks on board. This is the only way we're going to get fresh food going to Mars, and that is if we grow it ourselves. The next thing I want to talk about is a lot of these medical things come from the environment that we live in, and we do a lot of sampling. We spend a lot of time up there sampling the surface, which you see me doing here in this picture, for bacteria, anything that's growing there, the air, the water, and even, I think, Kris, you mentioned the noise environment. We even do noise sampling from time to time. We also do a lot of radiation sampling. These are a couple of dosimeters that are on board. I think the one on the right is called a tissue equivalent proportion counter, which I think is a gold standard, or at least was back at the time, on how much radiation is coming on board. We also each carry a personal dosimeter with us all the time. Even when we go EVA in the suit, we take it out of our shorts or whatever, put it in the suit. We also do a lot of medical training. So each of us is designated a crew medical officer. That really means you're about sort of like EMT light, about that level of training, which, you know, if is probably good enough for what we need on ISS. As was talked about before, you know, we can evacuate and be on deck here within a matter of hours. You're on your way to Mars, that's not the case. So that implies that you're going to have better equipment, more ample types of gear to use, as well as better training. And I can tell you that the training that we do, this is one of the two major medical kits that was on board at the time, called the ambulatory medical pack. So this is the sort of the not severe. This is not the ER version. There's another ER version that has all kinds of scary stuff in it. This mostly has medications, as well as a lot of tools, stethoscope, that kind of thing. And eye problems, this is not one of those demonstrations, but it's pretty easy to get something in your eye up there. We spent a lot of time training for that, and I can tell you that in the 7 months I was up there, we had to use it a couple times because things float around a lot, and you just walk into something or float into something. But now, because of the problems that Vince first mentioned, and I can attest to them, I lost about 2 diopters of hyperopia in both eyes, or close to it in both eyes. That's a pretty big shift. It's hard to break down with how much I flew in my late 40s, so maybe that was just, you know, my arms getting too short, but that's a lot. I mean, my arms grew a lot in 7 months, let's put it that way. So this is Karen Nyberg, and I'm not sure what that device is, but I'm pretty sure it's related to this, to the eye issue. And here's Luca Parmitano, who I think is doing some kind of a self ultrasound of his own eye. This is a crew medical restraint system. So we actually practice doing CPR and other kind of procedures on folks in case that should happen. Here's a fake astronaut he's actually wearing an EVA helmet in there, so it's kind of a joke. But think about some of the implications. If you want to do chest compressions, how are you going to do that? This is how we decided. We actually put our feet on the ceiling and do chest compressions by pushing on the guy's chest that way. So this training is fairly thorough. We spend a lot of time in ERs before we fly, stitching people up and doing those kinds of things. Even going to OR, sometimes putting in airways, and I would say pretty advanced stuff. Here's one doctor working on another doctor, so that's kind of cheating. Lastly, and kind of, as I said, difficult to talk about from a technical standpoint, is psychological support. So I can tell you that the most important thing for me anyway was having contact with friends and family on the ground. And we had a wonderful suite of equipment that is only improved now on board. So we had email that at the time would get synced about 3 times a day. Now I think it's synced sort of simultaneously. We had something called an IP phone that probably 40% of the time you could literally pick up the phone and call any number on Earth. Now I think it's probably up to 80 or 90%. We had something called a crew web page where we could go to and people could post stuff on there. Friends could post messages or videos or whatever. You could ask the ground support team to send movies and that kind of thing. Now you can do that on the internet in relatively real time, I understand. When you're on your way to Mars, that's going to be tough because sometimes if you say hello, it's going to take 15 minutes or so for somebody to respond and say hello back to you. So that's something to think about. Another thing to think about is we love to take pictures. This is a shot of the cupola-looking nadir, so straight down at the Earth with some of the equipment that we use. On my mission, which was not a terribly active mission photographically, we took something on the order of 20,000 pictures. I think they blow that away now. So there's a lot of satisfaction looking out of the window and seeing your home from up there, or where you've been, or where your friend grew up, or whatever. And when you look back at Earth from on your way to Mars, this is what it's going to look like. It's going to be daytime all the time, so you won't even see stars, and let alone the Earth. So I think a lot of these psychological things, which even though I was up there for 7 months, I really didn't feel like I was that far away, because you can look down and see, or you could pick up the phone and call, or you could send an email or whatever. That's going to be a very different experience for the folks that are on their way to Mars. So that's all I had. Look forward to taking your questions along with the rest of the panelists.
Okay, so I apologize to some of the folks on this side of the room because when we're sitting, you're not going to be able to see us. So if you want to shift a bit, you certainly can, so we can have a better discussion. But I figured as you're pondering your questions, I will pose one of my own, which I always seems to be one which is commonly asked. And so my question to the rest of the panel is, and this is for each of you, do you believe that there's a showstopper biomedical problem right now? And if so, what is it?
Thank you. Currently today, I would say, given our policies and the technology, radiation is probably a showstopper for a lot of Mars missions. The one that's going to do a flyby is kind of on the edge of what we would consider as a government, the level of exposure that we would accept for astronauts. They're not a government agency, so they can do whatever they want, I suppose, and expose them as much as they want. But that would be it. Now, our agency, NASA, is planning on going to Mars in the 2030s time frame, so there's a lot of time to mitigate even radiation between now and then, either with shielding or pharmaceuticals, or there's some other cosmic ideas out there. So literally cosmic, I guess. But so I think that will be overcome. And I think that for a trip to Mars will not be a showstopper when we get to that point, when we have the technology of the engines that will get us there and that sort of thing. So.
Yeah, I think from our program standpoint, there are 3 things that poke out the farthest right now. If we were going to try and go in the next few years, and I think I agree with Vince, by the time we get to 2030s, we'll probably be in better shape. But those 3 things are radiation, as you mentioned. the psychosocial things that LA was talking about are really important. You know, when you don't have that cell phone and it's 20 minutes one-way communication back to home, and home is really far away, and you're cooped up in a very small volume with 4 of your best friends for 3 years. It's there's a lot of challenges there. We're working on solutions to those things, but those are challenges. The other one right now is food, frankly, and how do you have fresh food? You know, and Mike showed some people arriving with fresh food. You know, we'll try to grow some food along the way, pick and eat sorts of things, and friendly green things that you can go and spend some time with if you like. But you know, trying to get good, nutritious food that will last for that long a time in that radiation environment and will still be tasty is important. One of the interesting technologies we're looking at right now is 3D food printers. So you can have, you can bring the raw materials and print out a pizza for yourself or whatever you like, as long as we can keep the raw materials fresh for that time.
Well, they used up all my answers, so let me approach it a different way, and that is all of those things are definitely challenges, but what's common to all of them is that what makes them challenges is the duration aspect, and so the real technical problem is propulsion. We have to figure out a way to make this trip faster. If you solve that, then you reduce the time that you're exposed to radiation, you reduce the time that you have to eat, obviously. You reduce the time, and I think this next topic is one that really is going to need a lot of work. The time that you are relying on your ECLS, your environmental control and life support system, because you can't afford to have that thing fail when you're going that way, because turning around is really, really difficult. So we've had lots of failures on the ISS. We're in low Earth orbit. We have lots of redundancy. We have that luxury. But when you're in a small vehicle that's going really fast away from the Earth, that's a serious problem. So the longer, or to the degree that you can reduce your window of exposure to all of the things that Bill and Vince mentioned, you will be better off. And the way we do that is by having a different sort of non-chemical propulsion.
So we'd be very happy to take any and all questions. Can you guys hear everyone on the panel? Are we good? All right, very good. So if you don't mind, just say who you are, where you're from, and
what. Do you think you're spending enough time thinking about the surface stay on Mars, which would be longer than both transits, at the very least? Specifically, 38% gravity. Are you counting on that to provide recovery from zero G, or is it going to just slow down the decay? And aren't you interested in getting a centrifuge and finding out? So that's one thing. And the second thing is, you mentioned the R value and decompression sickness. So on Mars, with 38% gravity, you cannot use a big, heavy spacesuit, even as heavy as you had on Apollo. So with a lightweight spacesuit, if you want it to be flexible, it's probably going to be lower pressure. So if something goes bump in the night and you want to run outside from your habitat, you don't want to spend 23 hours doing it. So the question is, for the habitat, shouldn't the pressure be lower and the oxygen content be higher? And why is ISS and Orion, everybody's still focused on just standard sea level? Two factors to do with the surface, focusing on the surface thing.
I can address the first one, and the answer at this point is that we have no information about physiologic adaptation anything between 0 and 1G. Right? We're 1G animals, and when we move away from that, we adapt nicely, but we have no idea what kind of protection we would get from 3HG or 16G, because we haven't anyone been in that environment for long enough to see adaptation. Our assumption has to be at this point that we get zero protection from the 3HG, and so we're looking at worst case conservative approaches. There are some near-term potential solutions to getting some information about that, and that is that the space biology folks are getting ready to fly a rodent centrifuge, and with a long enough arm to keep the angular velocity low enough, we'll be able to spin some rodents, we think, for long periods of time at G levels that are between 0 and 1, so 3HG, 0.5G, and try to understand, at least for some systems, the ones that make sense, bone, muscle, cardiovascular, perhaps, because there's a different orientation for rodents, what sorts of adaptive responses these rodents have to those environments. There's also a possibility in the future for NASA for some of the cislunar objectives that we have, that there would be something called an exploration augmentation module that's now being defined. That would be probably, it would be in cislunar orbit for a long period of time, and there might be missions to it that would allow us to have a different kind of centrifuge for animals, and maybe even some ways to test artificial gravity for humans, because it's not designed yet, if we think we need to after we do the rodent studies on the station. So yeah, that's a hard question. And it's one that we can't measure on Earth because you're contaminated by 1G. We can only do it in space, and there really haven't been facilities. It's really a shame that we lost a camp, the centrifuge accommodation facility, back 15 years ago, whenever they made that decision.
So just to follow up on that point, just before we move on to the decompression illness and the suit point, Bill, what are your thoughts on if we did have an extended presence of people on the moon itself? Is there some utility there to getting experience with what people do in 1/6 G if they're there for weeks to months?
Well, certainly you'd get one more point on that curve, wouldn't you? Yeah. And but I think if you didn't see protection from 1/6 G, you couldn't assume that you wouldn't have protection at 3/8 G. Right? If you got protection at 1/6 G, then you're pretty sure that you're going to get protection. And for which systems and for how long, right? So how does it change things?
Now, to come back to the decompression illness point and the suit point, perhaps you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding is that the newer suits that are being designed to be highly flexible, but also lighter weight and have higher pressure, not lower pressure specifically. So some of the kind of skin suits that I've seen early designs for and things that people are working on are designed so that the decompressive stress goes down, so the pressure change from your normal environment into your spacesuit per se is less than it is now, to try and reduce that factor. But it's not
Mechanical counter-pressure suits, like David.
correct. I think that, at least from what I've seen, that seems like the type of thing which will be extremely useful.
But that said, there doesn't seem to be a lot of downside to having like a 10.2 habitat, which is when we did EVAs from the shuttle, we depressurized the whole thing to 10.2 psi the night before, and then the pre-breathe requirement is next to nothing.
Yeah. So, yes.
How much time do you spend on the space station exercising, and how much time does it take when you come back to readapt to when gravity feel like you have your full strength?
So as I mentioned, we have 2.5 hours scheduled every day, Monday through Monday. And that includes, cleaning up and changing your clothes and all that kind of thing. So, I mean, how much time you actually under load? Maybe an hour and a half a day between cardiovascular and resistive exercise. And on the second question, anecdotally, I mean, I'll walk you through this sort of step by step, but anecdotally, it's about day for day. So if you're on a 2-week mission, 2 weeks after you land, you feel like you've never been anywhere. And if you're a 7th month mission, it takes about 7 months. And so what in stages, what comes back, I mean, some people have issues with what they call orthostatic intolerance, which is, you stand up and you feel faint. For most people, that resolves within minutes of landing. For long duration, it might be a little bit longer, but it's pretty quick. It has to do with being dehydrated. You lose usually about 10% blood volume and vasodilation, some stuff that these guys probably know better than I do. The next thing is vestibular. When you come back, you literally walk around like if you can walk, you walk around like you're drunk, because you're in my layman's terms, my brain is decoupled what I'm feeling from as a feedback device into what's going on, because I've been feeling like I'm floating for so long that I just quit paying attention to that signal. So the result is that when I feel like I'm falling over, which is now accurate, I don't pay attention to it, and I don't react until I see that I'm falling over, and that's why you sort of stumble around. So that lasts about 24 to 48 hours after a short duration mission, and probably a week maybe. Obviously it's decreasing in intensity. And then the last thing is just everything feels really heavy. You know, getting out of a chair, sitting up in bed, and you sort of have this very pervasive fatigue. So on a long duration mission, and I'm defining long as 6 months, we had a 45-day rehab period where we were hard scheduled every day to be with a trainer and to go through, you know, gradually more aggressive physiological training to get back to normal. And after 45 days, you're kind of on your own. So at 45 days, you're pretty functional. I mean, you're fully functional. You're driving again after 30. Most people can drive after about 2 weeks. And after 45, you know, you're cleared to travel. You can do a lot of things. But that pervasive fatigue takes a long time to go away.
No, just to follow up on that point, because I always think this is really interesting when I hear about it. We always talk about people going to Mars, and we envision that the spacecraft lands on Mars, and they all put on their EVA suits, and they stand out front, and they take a picture, and then they start going and doing stuff. And if it takes you 45 days after 6 months to kind of be signed off and say that you're pretty good, when a crew lands on Mars after a 9-month mission, are they useless, quote unquote, for 30 days, 45 days, 60 days? So how long would it be till you were actually able to get up, be exposed to gravity, and be functional again, given the fact there's nobody there to help you? So
I want to piggyback on it and say one more thing about that, and that is that my experience, which again was in 06, 07, so it's been a while now, and if bone mass density loss is a figure of merit, which I think it is, it's not the only thing that weighs into all this, but because we have better equipment on board and because our protocols are better, and I think they're actually taking some kind of nutrition supplement, it was typical when I flew to lose 2 to 3% of your bone mass density per month that you're on orbit. And I was just right in the middle of that. I think that now guys are coming back with, you know, very low single-digit bone mass density losses for 6-month missions. So things are improving, and my experience might not be accurate today, but I think what Kris points out is still valid question. It will be a non-zero time that people will be, you know, struggling.
yeah. Yes.
Go ahead. Earlier I saw it was like 13 issues associated with the altered gravity, and now this recovery time, I guess, is another one out of the vote maybe listed. But I guess the question is, does that, I mean, are they all solvable without artificial gravity or having a vehicle built that provides artificial gravity during the mission? If it's like a 6 or 9 month outbound trip, right? You talk about how useful is the crew when they land, and then not to mention the other orthostatic hypertension issues and things. But are they all solvable without artificial gravity, or should we think about artificial gravity as, you know, being incorporated in the spacecraft, or build a spacecraft to do artificial gravity for the outbound and, you know, try to alleviate at least that part of it?
So we are starting again to think about artificial gravity. As my friend Larry Young likes to say, artificial gravity is a topic that comes around and around and around. But you know, we are starting to think about that, and mainly I think that, you know, as Mike's experience and the charts he showed point out, the exercise devices we have now work pretty well, and so we can protect bone muscle and aerobic capacity and most of those things. What's a surprise is this visual impairment intracranial pressure, which seems to have to do with fluid shifts, and no amount of exercise is going to alter the fluid shifts. You have to have something like an LBMP or a spinning vehicle to do that. Having said that, it's sort of it's on the back burner right now in our program, and we're starting to look at it because we're worried about VIP. I think the better solution is the one Mike suggested, which is improved propulsion systems so you can get there more quickly. I think that, you know, some of what we're learning on station, we can protect things pretty well up to 6 months, most of the systems, and I think that if we can show the same thing on 1-year missions, that we've pretty much stabilized the state of people with the countermeasures that we have in the selection, then I think we're probably good to go for 30-month missions with the current set of countermeasures. But we have to be able to have smaller lighter weight, less powerful devices, so we have to have new approaches to doing some of the things that we do, because we're not going to fit an exercise device that's the size of a car in something you're sending to Mars.
Now, one point to that always gets brought up is people ask about rotating structures. And you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, but my understanding was to create a 1G environment in space with a rotating structure, it has to be enormous. So the radius would be huge.
There are a couple of suitable designs, one that was developed by Ken Houston and a group at JSC, and another one that was developed by Stanley Borowski at Glenn Research Center, that use conventional propulsion systems and can spin people at 1G continuously at low at RPMs you could adapt to, so 4 to 6 RPM, for about the same cost as a conventional space vehicle would be. So it's not going to, the mass volume power trade-offs are reasonable.
Okay.
So it's doable. It's but there are a number of other challenges that get introduced when you start spinning a vehicle. So we're looking at solutions that might be a spinning vehicle, but might be a part of a vehicle that spins kind of like in 2001, but smaller. And might be something inside a vehicle that's a spinning exercise device or something that we're not. Some of that stuff we can learn about on the ground. Some we can't learn about until we go to space.
All right. Yes.
Quick question. You mentioned about the problems with the eyes in microgravity. What about the brain in the same sort of environment? Because we can't exercise that like we can our arms and our legs. I mean, there are mental exercises, but they're not designed to deal with a lack of gravity.
Right now, the intracranial pressure that we've seen on orbit has, first of all, not been terribly great. So it's been, in comparison to some of the things, some of the diseases, illnesses we see on the ground, it's relatively low. We also haven't seen the side effects, the mental side effects that go along with those diseases that we might compare on the ground. So there are conditions on the ground where people have increased intracranial pressure as a disease condition, and we look at those and they don't compare very well. So we don't see the same mental or cognition issues from the microgravity with the folks on orbit. It does seem to be translating mainly to functional vision issues. That's something that, again, is another thing is kind of hard to study, because the way we study intracranial pressure on the ground is we put a tap in somebody's spinal column and we check the pressure. It's difficult for a lot of reasons to do that in space. One, you don't want to introduce a risk of infection in that area, and two, there's no normalization. We don't have a way to check it compared to what might be on the ground when you have gravity, which is what we compare to when we open the cerebrospinal fluid on the ground. We compare it to gravity. So we're challenged with that, and Bill's probably got programs working to try and get at the intracranial pressure on orbit so we can have some more information about that, but we're not far enough along to know. As far as the actual cognition and mentation in orbit, they're more than, I'll let Mike answer, but the astronauts are pretty challenged right now intellectually all day long with the jobs that they have to do, and so I haven't seen any kind of apparent decrease in mentation with the folks that are on orbit, and that would go along with the behavioral health challenges of going on a long duration mission. How do you keep people engaged mentally for that long a period of time? The folks that are going to do the flyby are planning on doing some science and stuff while they're going, but they're also planning on spending a whole lot of time doing public address talks with people back on Earth. So somebody's going to have to put a lot of thought into how you keep people engaged intellectually for 6 months if you can't make it shorter. So going back to the artificial gravity question, I talk to high schoolers a lot, and I tell them at the end there's a short list of what we want, our dream sheet, and one of those things would be true anti-gravity. We don't know what doing 6 months going around in circles does to your head, so that you might be able to adapt to it. That angular momentum in your your semicircular canals, might not be good for you. We don't know. So if we could recreate gravity in orbit, that'd be really helpful. Certainly a warp drive would be helpful, and then a way to, and then we need to have what Star Trek had, which was electromagnetic shielding, so we don't have to worry about radiation. And a lot of those things, believe it or not, are not that far away technologically. People have said, oh, it's impossible, but we're getting close on some of those things, like electromagnetic shielding. The technology now is catching up, where that might be possible within the time frame we're looking at. So.
To address the being intellectually challenged, I cannot remember the name of it, but we do have a tool on board that we can use to sort of do a very quick assessment of what our cognition is like on a given day. Some people like to do it if they're going to go do an EVA or some, a high intensity task, and I'm sure that we do that post-flight, we do it pre-flight, so we have some ways to compare what our cognitive ability has done over time. It's a pretty simple test. You have to remember a sequence of numbers and that sort of thing. The other thing I want to say, anecdotally, I have no idea what the physical causes of this might be, physiological ones, but most folks, and definitely I, for a while felt something we call space brain, where you sort of get up there and you just feel a little bit thick. And my sort of layman's interpretation was, how you have your computer starts running slow and then you realize you've got 15 programs open, so you just close a few of them and it runs better. There's a lot going on when you first get up there, and I think you're literally processing a lot of different inputs that you haven't had to do ever. And so perhaps it's that. It definitely gets better over time when you're up there, and so I don't know. That seems to be more of a cognitive kind of cause than a physiological one. Well, I guess it's all physiological at some point, but in any case, there is that effect that most people that I've flown with at least have reported that they have as well.
Yes?
I wonder if you could say more about how the altered gravity affects the immune system. That one was the least obvious to me.
Yeah, I'm not a specialist in immune function, but I'm probably the closest here. At the beginning of our research program 15 or 20 years ago, when we first started looking at immune changes, we were having trouble separating out changes in the stress associated with launch and landing from being in microgravity. And now we have enough information about changes that are going on in the body to know that there's an elaboration of latent viruses that are shed when you're in space, and it persists for long periods of time. And there are changes in some of the cytokines that are used in the immune system that seem to be a function not of the transients associated with launch and landing, but of the long-term exposure to microgravity. A number of the stressors in flight act by having oxidative species that start circulating around in the blood. And this is radiation. This is some of the mental effort problems, stress in general, and so that's challenging the immune system on a regular basis. So there are a number of different directions that point to some changes in the immune system that have to do certainly with spaceflight, but also specifically with microgravity.
Yes?
I have read, I guess there are drugs that can reduce the rate of decalcification and things like this, but I've also read where sometimes the different nations involved in the space, in space don't share this information. Has that been overcome? I mean, I read this quite a long time ago. Has it been overcome where there's now free sharing of information? The Russians are not trying to hide stuff from us. We're not trying to hide stuff from them. Or is it still that we know what we won't tell you?
My experience, and I just got back from Russia last week. We're working with our colleagues on some of these one-year mission issues. There's since the 90s, when we had the Phase 1 program where we had U.S. astronauts flying on Mir Station, we developed a fairly close relationship with the Russians and do a fair amount of data sharing. There are differences in IRBs from one nation to another. This is the review boards that review the ethics and what's allowed to be shared back and forth. And there are differences in the way that they collect data and interpret data. And I say that, I'm talking about the Russians, but also the Europeans and the Japanese and the Canadians and the Chinese, although we don't get to work closely with the Chinese, all have slight differences in the way that they collect data and who they can share data with and what the processes are. So we end up with legal issues that get in the way more and trying to develop appropriate data sharing agreements that will be acceptable in the different cultures. It's probably a bigger thing than anybody holding back data from us. While that might have been true sometime in the past, I don't think it's true at all. There's a lot of data sharing at international conferences and where we can giving individual independent data. And certainly on the medical side, Vince was just talking about multilateral medical operations panel meeting he has coming up, and all the space station partners work together to develop their procedures and share information. You might want to say about how you do that.
Well, we started making some progress, I guess, with the Russians maybe 5 years ago or so. But it's more on a case-by-case basis. It's not like if they have an investigation they want to do, they can tap into our database, or if we're doing an investigation, we can tap into theirs. But for instance, the visual acuity issue, they agreed early on to start passing information back and forth. Now, with that passing of information, there's a little bit of a challenge because they don't necessarily assess their data the same way as we do. And so when they looked at visual acuity over the years, it was done a little bit differently. And so we had to translate their data to something that equated to our data. And so there's a little bit of a challenge. It's not a one-for-one once you get it either. But right now I think we're getting good data exchange, but it's more on a when they ask for it or when we ask for it sort of thing. We've had a program in place since the astronauts began flying to monitor their health not only during flight but afterwards when they would come back for annual exams. And we have a large database, and in that database we have some international partners besides the Russians, but the Japanese and the Europeans and the Canadians are in that database as well, and there's those international agreements that allow us to share data, but again, it's sort of on a by case particular study basis. It's not just all mixed together, basically. There's not one central database of health data yet, but maybe there will be soon. So.
Yes.
Mike, I'm wondering if you can share some thoughts on what it's like to be in an isolated, contained environment for 7 months, and then how that would translate to a trip to Mars, which is going to be a much more confined environment. And obviously for a longer trip, I mean, for the long stay, I think we're looking at 900 days round trip, something like that.
Well, I think, as I mentioned in the talk, I think this psychological support is a very important consideration. And all the things that I mentioned about, not being able to pick up the phone and not being able to see your plane and all that, those are going to be very key considerations. That gets to the question of crew selection. I think there are some things that we've learned in the last, say, 10 years about transitioning from a short-duration astronaut corps to a long-duration astronaut corps. Some of those things we learned from the Russians. Some of them we sort of figured out as we went, and I think we're getting better at that. We have developed some, we don't really have select-in criteria, but I think we have some select-out criteria now. But I think we have a long way to go in that regard. And I'm not talking about, I'm talking more the psychological rather than the physiological. That's a whole different ethical debate about, whether you do preemptive appendectomies on astronauts so they don't have one when they're appendicitis when they're on the way to Mars and things like that. So, on the other hand, it's a pretty, to be on your way to Mars, it's got to be pretty, motivating, and there's a lot of upside to that too. So everything, the human mind, I think, manages to put things in balance and in perspective in a pretty seamless way. And I'm not worried that we won't find astronauts that are suitable to do that sort of thing.
Yes.
I recall the space shuttle operated at 10 psi, didn't it, or 10.2? And I think the space station Freedom was originally intended to operate at 10.2 psi and was increased to 1 bar when the Russian elements were included. Do you see any possibility that the crews could operate at long duration missions at less than 1 bar?
Yeah, so the shuttle actually operated at 14.7 as well, but we did go down to 10.2 for certain periods of time to support spacewalks. So, to my knowledge, I don't know how much data we have on the duration that people have spent at 10.2, but it's 8 or 10,000 feet altitude equivalent. So I would think that it's not a problem.
Hi, can I answer that also? Because as the research community, we wanted it to be 14.7, which is why it was, because that's how research is conducted on Earth, and we want to be able to compare it. And I believe our nourishment will be done.
So we have long-term plans for spacecraft where that answer probably is not known yet. Short-term, the capsule they're building, they looked at a lower pressure, but they decided to go with 1 atmosphere.
Yeah, the Apollo, of course, was low pressure to save weight.
Even 8 or 10,000 feet, you can adapt to it over time, which is okay. We're talking probably 6 weeks, but to adapt. But for us to go up to 8 or 10,000 feet, there are some physiologic changes that would not be necessarily something you'd want. I mean, your color vision goes at about 10,000 feet. So, so that is a challenge. But I mean, whether you pre-adapt somebody or not to that for that type of a mission, if you were going to use that capsule, but that's an engineering trade-off thing that they're going through right now. I believe the current capsule now, though, for the current the asteroid missions is going to be 1 atmosphere.
Is it an airplane, airliner, like 6,000 feet equivalent, something like that?
6 to 8.
Yeah.
So we got time for one last question. Yes.
Oh, I was just wondering, you were talking about the extending the acceptable radiation exposure limits, and then you made an offhand comment. I just wanted to know, like, if you meant it. You said that ExploreMars are very private. You said, I guess they can do whatever they want.
Well, they're not a government agency, so government agencies are sort of held to protecting the workers the same as any other government employee, and so we have to.
Standard laws wouldn't apply to this kind of.
Well, OSHA doesn't regulate space.
Yeah.
They regulate the work environment on the ground. So, to my knowledge, nobody's regulating space, and so if they have people that volunteer to do it, I think they can go and pretty much do what they want to do.
I can add something to that not with my NASA hat on, but with my Commercial Spaceflight Federation hat on. So he's right. I mean, he's not quite right. The FAA does regulate space, but right now they just regulate for third parties, so uninvolved public, protecting property, that sort of thing. The participant experience is unregulated now. It's under what they call an informed consent regime, just like a lot of this experimentation. So you sign a piece of paper, you say, I understand the risks, I'm willing to do it, and off you go.
All right, so we're out of time, but I wanted to thank you all for your excellent questions and good discussion.